The first sign was the survey stake, a single wooden stake, hammered into the ground, 3 feet inside my property. At first I thought it was a mistake, maybe a contractor, maybe a utility company, something routine. But then I noticed the markings, bright orange paint, survey ribbon, and a project number. A project number I recognized, because I had seen it before, 6 months earlier, at a county planning meeting. A meeting most people ignored, a meeting that discussed a proposed $20 million expansion around our lake, new cabins, a private marina, walking trails, luxury waterfront lots. The kind of project developers dream about, the kind of project that makes property values explode, the kind of project that attracts attention from everyone, including our HOA, especially our HOA president, a man named Richard Mercer. Richard loved reminding everyone that he controlled the neighborhood, he controlled the board, he controlled the committees, and according to him, he controlled the future of the lake. What Richard didn't know was that his future depended on a piece of land, a very specific piece of land, my land. The small lakeside retreat my family had owned for nearly 30 years, the same property he had spent months trying to take from me, the same property he claimed didn't belong there, the same property he said was standing in the way of progress. What he didn't understand was that progress had a problem, a very expensive problem. Because buried inside hundreds of pages of county records was a detail nobody seemed to notice, a detail worth $20 million. And when Richard finally discovered it, everything changed. The HOA, the developers, the county, the project, all of it. But by then, it was far too late to stop what had already started. And it all began with that survey stake sitting 3 feet inside my property. I pulled the survey stake out of the ground. Then I drove straight to the county records office. Not because I was worried, because I was curious. The project number bothered me. I had seen it before, and I wanted to know why it suddenly appeared on my property. The clerk at the records counter recognized the number immediately. That surprised me. Usually they had to search. This time they didn't. The man looked at the screen, then looked at me, then looked at the property address. His expression changed, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. He asked a question, a simple one. "You're the owner?" I nodded. The clerk paused, then printed several documents. More than I expected. Far more. He slid them across the counter and quietly said something strange. "You may want to keep copies of these." That was it. No explanation. No warning. Just those words. I spent the next hour reading, and every page raised more questions. The expansion project wasn't small. It stretched around nearly half the lake. Several developers were involved. So were investors, construction companies, engineering firms, environmental consultants. Millions had already been spent. Permits had been filed. Studies had been completed. Timelines had been approved. Everything looked ready. Everything except one thing. A section near the center of the project map. A section highlighted in yellow. My property. I stared at it, then stared again. The highlighted area wasn't large. Just a narrow strip running beside the shoreline. Nothing impressive. Nothing valuable at first glance. Yet it appeared on nearly every planning document. Every map. Every engineering sketch. Every access layout. That seemed odd. Very odd. So I took the papers home and started digging. The deeper I looked, the stranger things became. 3 days later, another surprise arrived. An HOA violation notice. The timing felt deliberate. The notice claimed my lakeside deck violated community guidelines. A deck that had existed for years. A deck approved years ago. A deck nobody had complained about. Until now. The fine wasn't huge. But the message was clear. Richard was paying attention. I ignored it. At first. Then a second notice arrived. This time for landscaping. Then another. And another. Mailbox placement. Fence appearance. Storage shed color. Every week brought something new. The violations felt manufactured. Even several neighbors noticed. One afternoon, my next-door neighbor, Mark, stopped by. Mark had lived beside me for almost a decade. Quiet guy. Rarely involved in neighborhood drama. But even he looked irritated. He held up a violation notice of his own. Richard's board had cited him for parking a fishing trailer. A trailer that had sat in the same location for years. Neither of us said much. We didn't have to. Something had changed. And everyone could feel it. The atmosphere around the neighborhood became tense. People stopped chatting at the boat launch. Stopped lingering near the marina. Stopped attending HOA meetings. Because every meeting turned into the same thing. Arguments. Complaints. Threats. And Richard standing at the front of the room, acting like he owned the entire lake. Then came the first real warning. A certified letter. Not from the HOA. From an attorney. That got my attention. The letter claimed part of my property boundaries were under review. According to the attorney, discrepancies had been discovered in historical records. The language sounded official. Carefully written, deliberately vague. But one sentence stood out. The HOA reserved the right to pursue corrective action. Corrective action. Interesting phrase. I called the attorney listed on the letter. He wouldn't explain much. Only that concerns had been raised. Raised by whom? The answer wasn't surprising. Richard Mercer. I thanked him and hung up. Then I called a surveyor. If someone wanted to challenge my property lines. I wanted facts. Not opinions. The survey took weeks. Longer than expected. And during those weeks the pressure increased. More notices. More complaints. More inspections. At one point, an HOA compliance committee actually photographed my cabin from the shoreline. Several neighbors witnessed it. Nobody liked it. Word spread quickly. People started talking. Quietly at first. Then openly. Many believed Richard was targeting me. The question was why. I still didn't have an answer. At least not yet. Then the survey results arrived. The surveyor showed up in person. That alone told me something. Most surveyors simply email reports. This one drove out to the lake. He carried a thick folder. And looked puzzled. Not concerned. Puzzled. As if something didn't make sense. We stood beside the water. Looking across the shoreline. The surveyor pointed toward a narrow strip of land running between my property and an old service road. A strip I barely paid attention to. Most people wouldn't. It wasn't attractive. Wasn't developed. Wasn't useful. Just grass and trees. But according to the surveyor, it mattered. A lot. The records confirmed my ownership. Every inch of it. No discrepancies. No boundary issues. No mistakes. The HOA's claims were completely unsupported. That should have ended everything. But instead, things became worse. Because someone else had received the same survey report. Richard. And within days, another development occurred. One that finally revealed his real objective. A special HOA meeting was announced. Emergency agenda. Mandatory attendance encouraged. That wording alone raised eyebrows. The meeting room filled quickly. Far more residents than usual. People wanted answers. The tension was obvious. Even before Richard arrived. Then he walked in carrying a stack of folders. Smiling. Confident. Far too confident. The meeting began. Routine business first. Then suddenly, he introduced a proposal. A new community improvement initiative. That sounded harmless. Until details emerged. The initiative would allow the HOA to acquire certain shoreline properties. Through purchase agreements, land swaps, and in some cases, compulsory legal action. The room went silent. Several homeowners exchanged looks. Everyone immediately understood what was happening. Richard never mentioned my name. He didn't have to. Every person in that room knew exactly which property he wanted. Mine. The proposal sparked immediate backlash. Men who rarely spoke stood up. Question after question followed. Why now? Why these properties? Who benefits? Richard dodged every answer. Carefully, professionally, but not convincingly. Then one homeowner asked a question that changed everything. A retired engineer named Carl. Carl had reviewed some public planning documents himself. And unlike most residents, he paid attention to details. Carl stood, looked directly at Richard, and asked something simple. Does this have anything to do with the expansion project? The room froze. Richard hesitated. Just for a second. But everyone saw it. Then he denied it. Quickly. Almost too quickly. That single moment changed the mood. People weren't suspicious anymore. Now they were interested. Very interested. The meeting ended badly. Arguments followed into the parking lot. Neighbors gathered in small groups. Comparing notes. Discussing rumors. Trying to understand what was really happening. And for the first time, Richard looked nervous. Not angry. Not frustrated. Nervous. That caught my attention. Because powerful people don't get nervous without a reason. A week later, I discovered what that reason might be. Not from the HOA. Not from the county. But from a developer. A man I had never met. He showed up unexpectedly at my cabin. Unannounced. Driving a company truck. He introduced himself. Looked around carefully. Then asked if we could talk privately. The request felt unusual. But his expression told me this wasn't casual. So we sat on the deck. The same deck Richard wanted removed. The developer studied the shoreline for several moments. Then asked a question. A question nobody had asked before. Has anyone explained why your property matters so much? I told him no. He nodded slowly, as if he expected that answer. Then he said something that immediately changed everything. Something that made every violation notice. Every survey challenge. Every HOA meeting. Suddenly make sense. Because according to him, the entire $20 million expansion depended on a legal access corridor. And that corridor crossed land nobody thought twice about. Until they checked the deeds. Until they checked the surveys. Until they checked my property. The developer reached into his briefcase, pulled out a folded map, and placed it on the table. When I opened it, I finally understood why Richard had been trying so hard to get rid of me. But the map revealed something else too. Something Richard clearly didn't know. And when I saw it, I realized the real fight hadn't even started yet. The map covered nearly my entire deck. Colored lines crossed the shoreline. Access roads, utility routes, drainage corridors, future construction zones. But one line stood out. A thick red corridor, running directly through the strip of land beside my property. The same strip nobody had cared about for decades. The developer tapped the map, then tapped it again, as if he wanted to make sure I understood. Without that corridor, nothing moved forward. Not the roads, not the utilities, not the marina expansion. Nothing. I asked the obvious question. Why not simply route around it? The developer gave a tired smile. Apparently that question had already been asked. Many times. The terrain created problems. The lake frontage created problems. Environmental restrictions created problems. Every alternative route cost money. Serious money. Months of redesign. Additional permits. Additional studies. Additional approvals. The red corridor was the easiest option. The cheapest option. The approved option. And according to county records, part of it crossed my land. The developer leaned back, then said something unexpected. Richard didn't originally know that. I stared at him. He nodded. The first project drafts had used older property information. Incomplete information. Nobody noticed the issue until a title review uncovered it. Then everything changed. I suddenly understood why the pressure campaign had started. The violations, the surveys, the attorneys, the meetings. Richard wasn't trying to enforce HOA rules. He was trying to remove an obstacle. Me. The developer left shortly afterward. But before leaving, he offered one final warning. Expect more pressure. Then he drove away. For several minutes I just stood there, looking at the lake, looking at that narrow strip of grass, a piece of land I had barely noticed for years. And now everyone seemed obsessed with it. The next week proved his warning was accurate. The pressure intensified immediately. Another certified letter arrived. Then another. This time the language was stronger, more aggressive, more urgent. One letter suggested mediation. Another suggested settlement discussions. A third hinted at possible litigation. The volume alone felt deliberate, like someone wanted me overwhelmed. Meanwhile, strange things started happening around the neighborhood. Contractors appeared. Survey crews returned. Property markers multiplied. Several neighbors reported receiving visits from project representatives. Questions about easements. Questions about access. Questions about future improvements. The lake community had become a construction zone before construction even began. Then came the first mini twist. One evening Mark showed up carrying paperwork. A lot of paperwork. He looked frustrated, almost angry. He dropped everything onto my kitchen table. Most of the documents involved HOA committee meetings, internal correspondence, planning notes, budget records. Mark had obtained them through a records request. And buried inside hundreds of pages was my address, repeated over and over, sometimes highlighted, sometimes underlined, sometimes attached to discussions that had nothing to do with HOA business. That bothered several homeowners, including Mark. because the HOA wasn't supposed to operate that way. My property had become an obsession. One board member even questioned it in the notes. The response was interesting. Not from Richard. From another board member. A man named Douglas. Douglas had served on the board for years. Quiet. Methodical. Not known for drama. According to the notes, Douglas repeatedly asked why so much attention was being focused on a single homeowner. Those questions never received direct answers. Instead, discussions moved elsewhere. That detail caught my attention because it suggested something important. Not everyone on the board supported Richard. A crack had formed, and cracks tend to spread. A few days later, another surprise arrived. Douglas called me directly. I had never spoken to him before. Not once. He sounded cautious, like a man choosing every word carefully. He asked if we could meet. Off-site. Away from the neighborhood. That request alone told me plenty. We met at a small diner 30 minutes away. Douglas arrived carrying a folder. Not a large folder. Just enough paperwork to make a point. The moment he sat down, he looked exhausted. Not physically. Mentally. Like someone tired of carrying information. For nearly an hour he spoke carefully. Never making accusations. Never speculating. Just describing events. Board meetings. Closed sessions. Conversations. Decisions. A pattern emerged. Richard had been pushing aggressively for months. Far more aggressively than most board members realized. Every discussion somehow returned to my property. Every proposal somehow involved my shoreline. Every strategy somehow focused on acquiring access. Douglas finally admitted something. The board itself wasn't fully informed. Several members believed the issue involved future community amenities, not a private development project. That changed everything. Because if true, some board members had been operating with incomplete information. Douglas slid a document across the table. A memorandum. Nothing dramatic. Just a summary. But one paragraph stood out. The document referenced ongoing coordination with outside development interests. Outside development interests. Interesting phrase. Especially for an HOA. Douglas quietly said he had concerns. Serious concerns. Then he stood, gathered his things, and left. The entire meeting lasted less than an hour. But its impact lingered for days. Because now I knew something important. Richard wasn't acting alone. Someone else wanted access. Someone with money. Someone with influence. Someone who preferred staying invisible. Then things became even stranger. Construction equipment began appearing near the proposed project area. Not active equipment. Staged equipment. Parked equipment. Waiting. Excavators. Dump trucks. Survey trailers. Temporary fencing. The project wasn't officially approved yet. Yet preparations were clearly underway. That made several residents nervous, including longtime homeowners who rarely involved themselves in community issues. One afternoon, a group gathered near the marina. Mostly retired men. Property owners. Boat owners. Men who had lived there for decades. The mood was tense. Nobody liked what they were seeing. Nobody liked the secrecy. And nobody liked Richard's refusal to answer questions. One resident named Alan confronted him directly. Right in the marina parking lot. Several witnesses watched. Alan demanded transparency. Richard refused. The exchange became heated. Not hostile, but tense. Richard eventually walked away. Yet witnesses noticed something. He wasn't confident anymore. He looked pressured. The kind of pressure that comes from deadlines. The kind of pressure that comes from promises. The kind of pressure that comes when other people expect results. Then another twist arrived. And this one came from the county. A public notice. Small. Easy to overlook. Most residents never read it. I did. The notice referenced a planning commission review. Nothing unusual there. But attached to it was a revised project timeline. The date immediately caught my attention. The developers were running out of time. Certain approvals would expire. Certain permits would require renewal. Delays carried consequences. Expensive consequences. Suddenly, Richard's urgency made sense. Every month mattered. Every week mattered. Possibly every day. That realization changed my perspective. For the first time, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was watching, waiting, observing, and eventually someone made a mistake. A very costly mistake. It happened on a Thursday morning. I returned to the cabin after running errands. The moment I pulled into the driveway, something felt wrong. Fresh tire tracks crossed part of my shoreline. Deep tracks. Heavy equipment tracks. I got out immediately, walked toward the lake, and found several new survey markers. Installed without permission. Inside my property boundaries. Not near the boundary. Inside it. Several feet inside. Someone had entered my land and left evidence behind. I photographed everything. Every marker. Every track. Every disturbed section of soil. Then I called the surveyor. He arrived later that afternoon. The moment he saw the markers, his expression hardened. He checked coordinates, checked records, checked boundary references, then quietly confirmed what I already suspected. The markers were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Significantly wrong. Someone had intentionally shifted them. The surveyor documented everything. Carefully, professionally, methodically. Before leaving, he said something that stayed with me. This isn't an accident. Those 4 words changed the entire situation. Because accidents happen. Miscommunications happen. Mistakes happen. But this looked different. Very different. The following morning brought another surprise. A county inspector arrived. Unannounced. Not because I had called. Because someone else had. An anonymous complaint. The inspector reviewed the property. Walked around. Took notes. Then finally asked a question. A question that made my stomach drop. He wanted to know whether I had authorized any recent site preparation work. I told him absolutely not. The inspector exchanged a look with another official standing nearby. Neither man seemed pleased. Then they revealed something I hadn't known. Someone had recently submitted documentation indicating access work was expected to begin near my shoreline. Access work. Near my shoreline. The inspector closed his folder, then looked directly at me, and asked if I had signed any agreements with the development group. I hadn't. Not a single one. The inspector nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something. Then he handed me a business card. Before leaving, he offered a warning. A careful warning. One that felt unusually serious. Because according to him, a meeting had already been scheduled. A meeting involving county officials, developers, project representatives, and people connected to the HOA. A meeting nobody had told me about. A meeting centered around access rights. A meeting scheduled for the following week. And somehow, my property was the main item on the agenda. But what worried me most wasn't the meeting itself. It was the final thing the inspector said before getting into his truck. Apparently someone attending that meeting believed the access issue had already been resolved. The problem was, I had never agreed to anything, and I was about to find out who thought they could speak for me. The county meeting took place the following Tuesday. Not at the lake, not at the HOA clubhouse, at a government office nearly 40 miles away. That alone felt unusual. The room wasn't large, just a conference room. A long table, stacks of documents, several county officials, a few attorneys, project representatives, and Richard. The moment I walked in, heads turned. Some looked surprised. Others looked uncomfortable. Richard looked irritated, as if my presence complicated something. That immediately raised questions. Because if the meeting involved my property, why did nobody invite me? I took a seat. Nobody objected. Nobody welcomed me either. The meeting began. The county officials handled most of the discussion. Project timelines, permit requirements, environmental reviews, infrastructure planning, routine topics. Then the conversation shifted. Access rights. The room noticeably changed. Everyone became more attentive. One county planner opened a file, then referenced the shoreline corridor, the same corridor running through my land. Several representatives began discussing it as though everything had already been settled. That caught my attention immediately. Then it got worse. One representative stated that property cooperation had already been secured. I looked around the room, confused, because nobody had secured anything from me. The county planner paused, looked toward Richard, then looked toward another attorney. Neither spoke. The silence lasted only seconds, but it felt much longer. Finally, I interrupted. I simply asked one question. What cooperation? The room froze. Several people turned toward me. One attorney adjusted his glasses. Another flipped through paperwork. The planner looked confused. Genuinely confused. Then he asked me to identify myself. When I did, everything changed. The planner's expression shifted immediately. He looked down at his file, then back at me, then back at the file again. Something wasn't matching. That much was obvious. The room suddenly became very quiet. The planner carefully asked another question. Had I signed any easement agreements? No. Had I signed any access agreements? No. Had I authorized any project use of my property? Absolutely not. The silence that followed felt heavy. One project representative whispered something to another. Richard stared straight ahead, not speaking, not moving, not reacting, which was strange, because he usually had something to say. The planner closed his folder, then requested a brief recess. Everyone left the room, except me, and one county official. He remained seated, reviewing documents, page after page. His expression grew increasingly concerned. When the meeting resumed 20 minutes later, the atmosphere had changed completely. Questions replaced assumptions. Verification replaced confidence. Documents were examined. Signatures were reviewed. Property records were requested. Nobody seemed comfortable anymore. Then came the first major crack. A project attorney admitted there appeared to be unresolved ownership issues. Unresolved ownership issues. That phrase triggered immediate reactions. Several representatives looked frustrated. Others looked angry. One man slammed a folder shut. Not dramatically. Just enough to reveal his frustration. Deadlines were clearly involved. Expensive deadlines. The meeting ended without resolution. But the damage had already been done. Because now county officials knew something wasn't right. And once government agencies start asking questions, things tend to get complicated. Very quickly. Word spread through the neighborhood within days. Not official information. Rumors. Speculation. Fragments of conversations. People sensed trouble. Construction activity slowed noticeably. Survey crews disappeared. Contractors became less visible. Several residents noticed. And they talked. A lot. Then another unexpected development emerged. Douglas called again. This time he sounded concerned. Far more concerned than before. We met at the same diner. The moment he arrived, I knew something had happened. His hands shook slightly. Not from fear. From stress. He sat down. Then immediately told me 3 HOA board members had demanded answers. The county meeting had created problems. Serious problems. Questions nobody could ignore anymore. Questions involving communications. Authorizations. Representations. And property access. According to Douglas, some board members were furious. Not because the project faced delays. Because they believed they had been misled. That detail mattered. A lot. Trust inside the board was breaking down. And without trust, organizations become unstable. Then Douglas revealed something else. Something he had only recently discovered. Several months earlier, a private consulting group had been hired. Not by the developers, by the HOA. The consulting contract wasn't huge, but it focused on land acquisition strategy. Land acquisition strategy. Interesting choice of words, especially for a homeowners association. Douglas had questions. The board had questions. Nobody seemed satisfied with the answers. Then came another mini twist. The consulting contract had already been terminated. Quietly, without discussion, without explanation, without a vote. That caught everyone's attention. Because documents rarely disappear without reason. Someone wanted distance. The question was why. The following week brought another surprise. A registered letter arrived at my cabin. Not from the HOA. Not from a developer. From a title insurance company. I wasn't expecting that. Inside was a request. A formal request. They wanted access to certain historical property records. Specifically records involving the shoreline corridor. That request told me something important. Other people were digging now. Not just me. Professional investigators. Attorneys. Title specialists. People who follow paper trails for a living. And when those people start looking, they usually find things. Soon afterward, a retired resident named Walter approached me. Walter had lived near the lake longer than almost anyone. 40 years. Maybe more. He remembered things nobody else remembered. Old property sales. Road projects. Boundary disputes. Failed developments. Walter told me something interesting. Years ago, there had been another proposal. Smaller, much smaller, but it involved the same shoreline area. The proposal failed. Not because of money, because of access rights. I asked for details. Walter shrugged. He couldn't remember everything. But he remembered one thing clearly. Lawyers had spent months arguing over the exact same strip of land. The same strip now causing trouble again. That conversation stuck with me, because it suggested history was repeating itself. And history often leaves clues. Then things became personal. Very personal. One morning I walked outside and found a notice attached to my gate. No envelope. No postage. Just a printed document. The notice demanded immediate discussions regarding acquisition opportunities. No signature. No company name. No contact information. Nothing. Just pressure. The message was obvious. Someone was getting desperate. Neighbors noticed too. Mark was furious. Several others were furious. People started documenting everything. Photographs, emails, meeting notes, property records. The community had stopped trusting official explanations. Residents wanted facts. Then another unexpected event rattled the neighborhood. Douglas resigned from the HOA board. Effective immediately. The announcement shocked people. Douglas wasn't emotional, wasn't impulsive, wasn't the type to walk away. Yet he did. Without warning, without ceremony, without explanation. Rumors exploded. Some believed he was pressured. Others believed he was protecting himself. Nobody knew the truth. But his resignation sent a message. Something bigger was happening. Something serious. Then came the moment that changed everything. Late one afternoon, my attorney called. His tone was different. Focused. Direct. He asked if I was sitting down. That got my attention. Attorneys rarely ask that unless something matters. Apparently, the title investigation had uncovered additional records. Old records. Forgotten records. Records that nobody involved in the project appeared to have considered. Not the developers. Not the consultants. Not the HOA. Nobody. The records didn't just affect access. They affected control. Control over something much larger than anyone realized. My attorney wouldn't discuss details over the phone. He wanted to meet in person. Immediately. That night we sat in his office reviewing copies. Deeds. Amendments. County filings. Historic surveys. At first nothing seemed remarkable. Then he showed me a single document. One page. Just one. I read it twice. Then a third time. Because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The implications were enormous. Not just for Richard. Not just for the project. For everyone involved. The attorney leaned back. Then quietly explained what the document meant. And for the first time, I understood why certain people had been pushing so hard. Why the pressure campaign existed. Why deadlines suddenly mattered. Why everyone seemed nervous. Because if the document held up, the entire $20 million expansion wasn't merely delayed. It could be redesigned from the ground up. At extraordinary cost. The attorney folded the document, placed it back inside the file, then looked directly at me. His next words stopped me cold. Because according to him, someone connected to the project had likely discovered this issue months ago. And instead of reporting it, they appeared to have tried solving it quietly. Very quietly. Which meant the problem wasn't just the land anymore. Now it was about who knew. And when they knew it, 2 days later, county officials scheduled another meeting. Mandatory attendance. Additional agencies involved. Additional attorneys involved. And according to my attorney, several people were about to be asked questions they had been avoiding for months. Questions with documents attached. Questions with timelines attached. Questions that couldn't be brushed aside. The meeting date arrived. The conference room filled faster than before. More officials. More lawyers. More observers. And when Richard walked through the door, he wasn't carrying folders anymore. He was carrying something much heavier. The look on his face told me that. Because for the first time since this started, Richard looked like a man who already knew the outcome. And that was before the county official opened the file sitting in front of him. The county official opened the file. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the attorney seemed unusually quiet. Page after page was placed on the table. Property records. Historical surveys. Easement documents. Engineering plans. Then came the document my attorney had shown me. The same one. The room immediately changed. Several project representatives leaned forward. Richard looked down. One county official began outlining the findings. Slowly, carefully. The shoreline corridor wasn't the only issue. That was the first surprise. The second surprise was much bigger. The historical documents established rights that had never been properly addressed during project planning. Rights attached directly to my property. Rights that affected infrastructure access, utility placement, road alignment, and future expansion. The county official wasn't accusing anyone of wrongdoing. Not yet. He was simply explaining facts. But those facts hit the room hard. Several developers exchanged frustrated looks. One attorney closed his eyes. Another rubbed his forehead. Nobody looked happy. Then came the question everyone had been avoiding. Who knew about the issue? And when? That question triggered a very different conversation. Timelines appeared. Emails appeared. Meeting notes appeared. Internal memorandums appeared. One by one. The room spent nearly 2 hours reviewing records. Not arguing. Reviewing. Verifying. Cross-checking. And gradually a pattern emerged. The access problem hadn't been discovered recently. It had been identified months earlier. Possibly longer. That revelation landed heavily. Because millions had continued moving forward while the issue remained unresolved. Several county officials seemed particularly interested in that timeline. Very interested. Richard barely spoke. For a man who normally dominated every discussion, his silence stood out. The meeting ended without any dramatic confrontation. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, people left carrying folders, making calls, scheduling additional reviews. The consequences came later, over the following weeks. Quietly, methodically, one decision at a time. The first consequence arrived through the Planning Commission. The project was paused. Not canceled. Paused. At least officially. Additional reviews were ordered. Additional approvals were required. Additional documentation was requested. Every delay cost money. Lots of it. Engineering schedules shifted. Contractors adjusted timelines. Consultants submitted revisions. Investors began asking questions. The pressure that had once been directed at me shifted elsewhere, toward the people responsible for solving the problem. Then the HOA situation began unraveling. Board meetings became crowded. Very crowded. Residents who had ignored HOA affairs for years suddenly started attending. The clubhouse filled. Standing room only. People wanted answers. Many felt misled. Others felt embarrassed. Several were angry. Not because development had stalled, because they believed HOA resources had been used improperly. Questions came from every direction. Meeting records, legal expenses, consulting contracts, special committees, property acquisition efforts. The board struggled to respond. Then another twist surfaced. An independent review of HOA expenditures was requested. Nothing criminal. Nothing sensational. Just a review. But reviews have a way of uncovering details, especially when people start paying attention. And people were definitely paying attention now. Douglas attended one of those meetings. For the first time since resigning. The room went silent when he entered. Several homeowners approached him afterward. They wanted explanations, context, answers. Douglas remained careful, professional, measured, but his presence alone spoke volumes. The trust that once protected Richard had vanished. Completely. Then came the moment many residents had expected. Richard announced he would not seek another term as HOA president. The statement was brief. Less than 2 minutes. No long speech. No defense. No dramatic exit. Just a simple announcement. The reaction surprised me. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. The room simply sat in silence. Because by then, the damage had already been done. The neighborhood had spent months divided. Months fighting. Months dealing with tension that never should have existed. And everyone knew it. Meanwhile, the development project continued facing challenges. New engineering studies were commissioned. Alternative routes were explored. Additional negotiations began. Several proposals were considered. Some were practical. Others were expensive. Very expensive. Eventually, representatives approached me directly. Not through the HOA. Not through pressure campaigns. Not through anonymous notices. Directly. Professionally. Respectfully. The difference was obvious. Gone were the threats. Gone were the assumptions. Gone was the idea that my property could simply be pushed aside. Instead, they came with maps, reports, proposals, and questions. Real questions. The conversations lasted months. Longer than anyone expected. Because complex property issues rarely move quickly. Especially when millions of dollars are involved. But for the first time, the discussions were honest. That changed everything. We reviewed options, examined alternatives, considered impacts, looked at long-term consequences. No shortcuts, no pressure, just facts. Eventually, an agreement was reached. Not because anyone forced it, because it made sense. For everyone, the project moved forward, but not in its original form. Several sections required redesign. Infrastructure routes changed. Construction budgets changed. Timelines changed. The cost increased significantly, far more than developers originally planned. Yet the project survived. Barely. The version eventually approved looked very different from the one Richard had been pushing. And that difference mattered, because it protected existing property owners, protected shoreline access, protected rights that should never have been ignored. The lake community slowly recovered. Tension faded. Conversations returned. Neighbors started gathering at the marina again. Fishing tournaments returned. Weekend events returned. The atmosphere changed. Not overnight, but gradually. The way real communities heal. One conversation at a time. Months later, I ran into Walter near the boat launch. The same resident who remembered the old failed proposal. He laughed when he saw me, then shook his head. According to him, the entire situation could have been avoided. One honest conversation. That's all it would have taken. Maybe he was right. The strange thing is, the land everyone fought over never looked any different afterward. It remained the same narrow strip beside the shoreline. The same grass. The same trees. The same quiet stretch most people ignored. Yet that little piece of land had exposed something important. Not about property. About people. Because once pressure started building, everyone revealed who they really were. Some chose transparency. Others chose shortcuts. Some chose cooperation. Others chose control. And eventually, those choices caught up with them. Looking back now, the survey stake was never the real story. Neither was the project, or the money, or the development plans. The real story was what happened when one person became convinced he could decide the outcome before the facts were known. Because the moment Richard treated my property like an obstacle instead of a neighbor's home, everything started moving in the wrong direction. And once that happened, the consequences became impossible to avoid. Today the lake is quieter. Not empty, just calmer. The project exists. The neighborhood exists. The shoreline still looks much the same. And every time I walk past that narrow strip of land, I remember how close millions of dollars came to depending on assumptions instead of facts. A mistake that nearly changed everything. And a reminder that sometimes the smallest piece of a map turns out to be the most important part. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real HOA conflicts, neighborhood disputes, and property battles, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one.